welcome everybody, and we're delighted to start this last session in our webinar series on the Atlantic KetMed with a keynote speaker from the US, Max Shtein. So we're very welcome, Max. Delighted to have you here because Max, a few years ago with his colleague here, Eugene Stein, wrote a book called Scalable Innovation. And this book, published by CRC Press, really guided the development of our project. In particular, the inclusion of concepts of the system model when we interacted with our companies in the Atlantic KetMed project that's supported by the European Union under the Interregional Fund. So this concept of engaging with the companies involving the innovation audit and the value chains that we've spoken about includes this very important aspect. And so I was delighted when Max accepted our invitation to come and share his thoughts on reimagining healthcare in the future, using concepts based on the system model. So Max, I'll say no more for the moment, and I just look forward to your presentation. So thank you.
Well, it's great to be here, or there, or here and there. Thank you very much, Jer, for the invitation. You say you were delighted that I agreed. I was delighted to learn that somebody bought the book who's out of, not in my class, and I wasn't making them do that. So that, we teach classes, both Eugene and I, at our respective universities, and so this is the conflict of interest that's perfectly, okay for teachers to do, is to make their students buy their books, which we do. But we also try to practice these ideas in our daily life, where we invent and help people innovate and put solutions out into the world. Eugene used to work as head of licensing at HP Labs and has done a lot of engineering work himself, a lot of invention work himself, and consulted for a lot of companies, both kind of at the upper echelon of industry and startups that were just starting out. Currently, he's with Zoa Capital, head of intellectual property at this investment firm. He continues to lecture at Stanford University in their continuing studies program, essentially in the business school. And I teach at University of Michigan in engineering. Nominally, I'm a professor of material science and engineering with some joint appointments in other departments, including bizarre things like School of Art and Design. And I guess the theme is integration, lots of different ideas, lots of different disciplines. And we think that the system model is quite helpful. It's not the only thing, it's not the kind of the final say, but it could be quite helpful to analyze situations or problems in need of solutions, and then to guide technical solutions. And so today I want to talk about medicine, the future of medicine, or healthcare, I should say more broadly. And you'll probably be familiar with stories or topics like this. If we look back at how people used to practice medicine, how they used to go about making people healthier, there are some pretty outlandish things that we would think are kind of insane to currently, right? So people used to do bloodletting. They used to drill holes in the skull to treat headaches. Lobotomy was practiced for treating forms of mental illness. Kids used to ingest heroin on a regular basis. Poison for fevers and headaches like arsenic and mercury. Electric shock to treat homosexuality. And in a lot of these cases, the very premise of the illness that's being treated is kind of insane, right? So you look back on the past and you think to yourself, well, that people didn't know, right? And so they didn't know, and they were doing pretty stupid things, right? Like giving people another disease that would overwhelm the first. Anyway, so currently we look at the past and we think that it's pretty dumb, and then we look at some ideas about the future and we think, well, that's insane. That's never going to happen. That's never going to be possible. People are never going to let you into their house while they're not there, right? People aren't going to give strangers rides in their cars, and yet it happens every day today. So that's kind of our theme maybe today. In the present, the future looks crazy and the past looks dumb. And we're going to look at healthcare through that lens and try to imagine things that could seem crazy and impossible today, but maybe in retrospect, the current practices, some of the current practices might appear dumb. And then besides just kind of imagining things, we're going to try to come up with actionable insights and solutions to these things, because we're all, I think, here, people focused on invention and actually doing something about the current situation and making things better. So in the book, in the classes that we teach, we talk about a four-stage approach to innovation, which consists of, firstly, performing a proper problem analysis. It's in effect a problem finding exercise, which most organizations and students and practitioners get wrong, because they are in this mode of trying to find solutions very quickly before the time on the test is over. So they engage in problem solution a little bit too soon. We have various techniques to try to better understand the nature of the problem and to take people very systematically through that process. We analyze the problem using very specific concepts and models. One of those models is the 5-component system model. So that's under the Analyze tab, if you will. And Ket obviously has been deploying this model pretty successfully from the looks of it and from the conversation I've had with Cher. Once the problem is understood and analyzed in terms of the system's principles, for example, and understanding the scalability bottlenecks, we can deploy known tools for solving the problem. TRIZ, 40 principles of TRIZ, or I guess there's more, and other techniques that are known for problem solving can be deployed here, depending on the expertise, of the team that's working on the problem and where they want to go. And then we try to take action and try to find market opportunities. We could form ventures and develop business models to support the technology solutions that we come up with in the third stage. And the idea here is that the business models and technology solutions have to be strategic in the sense that they have to reinforce each other's actions. You don't want to have a business model that works against what the technology could naturally enable and provide as an advantage. So in KET stands for Key Enabling Technologies, and so it implies to us that people are not just Imagineers, they're not pure futurists. You want to develop actual technologies and do the actual innovation work, and you want to make this future happen. So that's what we're going to be focused on actions. Now, action without insight, it's counterproductive. It could lead to a lot of waste. And so we seek insights before we take action. There's three main types of insights that we're interested in, particularly for tech-based innovation. They're product insights, technical insights, and business insights. Product insights are obtained through established techniques like design thinking, for example. Some folks at Stanford are quite well known for promoting that approach, customer ethnography, and so on. Technical insights have to do with what the next big thing is in technology. You want to figure out what's going to enable a 10x range of improvement over the current state of the art, because by the time you put this thing out into the market, the puck has moved, so you have to skate to where the puck will be. And of course, you have to unseat the incumbent oftentimes. So you really are looking for 10x at the very minimum advantages. So, for example, ultra cheap DNA sequencing technology done on a massive scale that we're currently doing, that's a big technical advantage if you're trying to develop therapies that are based on different principles than before. Generally speaking, it is not the job of the consumer, the user, to know the answer to this question: what is the technical insight? The insight doesn't come typically from a large company, really, with an established business, because they've got these blinders on in trying to protect their entrenched technology and revenue stream. They need to protect their cash cows, and so they're paid to not understand and not see certain things, really. And so oftentimes it's startups that are tasked with creating the new technology that yields this 10x advantage. And it's also said that the startup is an organization in search of a viable business model. That's the purpose of a startup, really, is to figure out what would be the business model that supports this and leverages this technological advantage of 10x. And business insights have to do where you will build up that insurmountable competitive advantage. And in some cases, business models are going to be very different from what's currently practiced, and how you're going to support this new technology in a way that's going to yield a competitive advantage. There are also certain evolution patterns that we see in the world of technology. One of these, for example, is that technology evolves toward ideality. That is, the function that it performs is still performed, and in many cases better than previously, but the actual implementation becomes invisible to people who use it. Nobody knows really how their cell phones work or how GPS really works. They don't see the satellites with their eyes, and yet they can find their way to their destination these days, right? So part of this is imagining some kind of ideal, in some cases crazy future, what that future would look like, if you had a magic wand that you could wave and then a solution would come about. And then what we do after that is, after we paint a picture of the future of how things actually happen on a functional level, we start to do what we call backcasting, which is that we put ourselves in the future and then proceed to tell a story, to a kid, for example, or somebody else, about how that state of affairs had come about. What were the steps that took us from the dumb past into the perfectly normal present, right, that would have looked insane to us decades back. And so to close the circles here, the milestones that took us from here to there, embodied in specific product services, enabling technologies, and very importantly, the business models that enabled and sustained them. So to do this, we, in the book, for example, describe a few tools that we ourselves use regularly. These tools include the three magicians, a NineScreen View, and the 5-element system model. So just briefly, the three magicians, for example, is a tool by which we first take apart the situation into constituents to try to understand what's going on, how these parts interact, how something actually works. In healthcare, this could be quite challenging. It's instructive to examine the value chain, but you have to realize that it's a product of over a century, maybe several millennia of friction, if you will, between humans' desire to survive and feel better on a daily basis, various commercial interests that arise in offering solutions to healthcare problems, in the business and ethical regulations that arise when people do the wrong thing, right? And the science and technologies available to people at the time. The second magician is basically about zooming out of the current situation, trying to assess the scale of the present situation and solution, and gauge how scalable it might be. And finally, we can use this fallback, spring ahead magician that tries to understand what was in the past, what might happen in the future, given the current situation and how it works, right? With this last one in particular, fairy tales, it turns out, could be incredibly insightful and instructive. And we're going to come back to this point in a few minutes, and I'd like to actually look at two fairy tales today that that could be quite interesting and predictive, if you will, of what's happening currently. Right. So in the book, we have this example of a turkey that's fed every day for 1,000 days, and everything's fine. It might lay an egg, right, rear its offspring, but has no insight into what might happen to it just before Thanksgiving, right? Because nobody bothered to tell it, and not even its turkey friends, right? So at this level, the turkey can't actively deploy the third magician, right? The fall back, spring ahead kind of magician. So how could the turkey do this? The NineScreen View is a device that you could introduce here and illustrate how the magicians would collaborate to help the situation. So the first pulls our perspective up and attempts to see, in this case, let's say an industrial production system where the turkey is a component. In language of the 5-component system model, it's the packaged payload for protein that's destined for the dinner table, right? The talk is not really about turkeys and about rehashing the book, really, but if you use the same procedure to look at the healthcare system, there might be some insights. So when we're a patient, for example, interacting with a healthcare system, we are in that moment operating at the level of the turkey, right? But if we zoom out, so to speak, and try to understand from the system's perspective, what is it actually trying to do to us, with us? You know, how do we fit in? How do we fit in? So, you know, our current approach to health production, right? So the system's task is to produce health. We can look at this enterprise, very complex value chain, very intricate control points, you know, hidden oftentimes and so on. But the purpose is to take in, ingest unhealthy people and then spit them back out as healthy or slightly less sick patients, right? So it's a very reductionist view of things, but we're trying to use it as a tool to gain some kind of actionable insight into the nature of the problem. I'm married to a physician that, you know, she takes great pains to, you know, do right by her patients, you know, anyway, it could tell all kinds of stories. I myself enrolled in a semester-long course here on Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which then resulted in a startup company that attempted to do health and wellness. I'm also an engineer and a scientist, and I want to solve these problems. Right. So let's see what happens when we look at things this way. So let's look at one path here, which is an interaction with a healthcare system based on inpatient care, hospitalization. The idea is that the outcome is health, but the reality is that in the U.S. at least, there are a ton of hospital-acquired infections, well over 1 million hospital-acquired infections that occur, and about 100,000 deaths that are associated with these infections each year, right? So you know, in terms of the percentage, this may be low, but talk to the person that actually happens to be suffering from something like this, right? So it's a big problem for the person that's suffering. Now, if we consider the outpatient scenario, right? Person comes in contact with a healthcare system. They could go inside, see a doctor, you know, have some labs done, analysis performed. Somebody figures out what kind of ailment they've got. Patients diagnosed, right? They're given some prescription medicines and sent off on their way with a bunch of pills to take. A quarter of the population in the U.S. is on 5 or more prescription meds each day. And it's awfully hard to keep track of these things. And so half of the patients don't actually take their medications, okay, according to the prescribed regimen. And that's something that doctors and the healthcare system and the insurance companies are very well aware of. Okay, so the reality is that the health production flow happens to be ineffective in many cases, not in all cases, right? But in many cases, it's very ineffective, and it can even do damage. So here's a photo ward in a hospital during COVID times, I believe. Considerable crowding, of course, during these times in emergency departments across the world, but also patients experiencing very long wait times to get routine treatment. And in some cases, people die because they can't access, for example, drug infusion clinics for cancer treatment, or they couldn't, they can't access critical diagnostic infrastructure that is localized in the hospitals. And the common phrase that you probably heard during this past year or two is, in these COVID times, this is unprecedented. And in some sense, it's absolutely true, but in another sense, this sort of thing has actually happened many times before. So I mentioned fairy tales, so let's look at a couple of fairy tales. The first is Three Little Pigs. If you're not familiar with the story, two of the pigs in the story pursue work-life balance, which is inevitably biased toward fun, and it results in a lack of skills and resources, right? Which in turn yields houses that are constructed with very cheap materials and poor workmanship. So as a result, their houses get destroyed by an emergent threat that wasn't there previously, the wolf. It's unprecedented from the perspective of the pigs. So they shout and they run around, and eventually they find their friend or brother, the third pig. The third pig is a nerd. He's a total loser, you could say. He's toiling away without any friends. He's missing all of the excitement of the truffle cup. Tour de Pork, right, is on TV, Pigskin Bowl, and he's just not watching any of it. He's toiling away. He's got no life. The more outgoing and fun-loving cousins, they make fun of him all along the way, right, until the wolf shows up. And so until that threat emerges, Pig 3 is an idiot, right? But suddenly he's got two new best friends, and the wolf is thwarted, and the kid's story ends there, right? And the kids are basically asleep at that point. But the epilogue, the post story outcomes are kind of interesting, right? And you can imagine what might be happening is that now in Pigland there's a new home building technique, right? And there are materials which are now in high demand because brick houses are the only commercially viable construction technology, right? So if Pig 1, 2, and 3 form a corporation, right? I'm not sure how the stock options were going to be divided, but chances are Pigs 1 and 2 are going to start complaining about that, right? Because they forget what happened in the past and that their lives were in danger. And so, if we're not going to overthink the matter, you could see the parallels with the COVID crisis here, right? The healthcare system is just all of a sudden revealed to be very, very highly strained under these surges of emergency COVID patients. Patients with regular ailments can't get regular care that they enjoyed previously, although enjoyed may be kind of an overstatement here. And at the same time, you've got this huge infrastructure of expensive hospitals and expensive hospital equipment that's just idling. It's not being used at all, and so you can't charge for it, right? And so hospitals begin to bleed cash and are basically approaching financial ruin because you can't monetize that investment that's there. So the business model that they had previously operated under supported a diagnostics and a treatment technology implementation that required essentially all inpatient mode of interaction. And COVID-19 created the situation where becoming an inpatient was either impossible or ill-advised, right? So the traditional business model for hospitals basically, was under threat of collapse, right? Which was unprecedented. So right now, if you check into a hospital, it costs about, I don't know what it is in the UK or in Ireland. In the US, it's $2,000 to $3,000 per day. This is like a really expensive hotel and really bad food, relatively speaking. And you get chances of contracting a worse disease than what you checked in with, right? So if we only knew what was wrong with the patient ahead of time before they show up to the hospital, and knew how to deploy treatment, right, that'd be pretty good. Okay, so So let's consider that and look at a second fairy tale. How am I doing on time?
You're doing fine. Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
So another fairy tale would be the Little Red Riding Hood. So there's lots and lots of variations of this story, 50 plus variations dating back many, many years, over hundreds of years, actually. We're here mainly concerned with the version of the story that's probably most familiar to everybody. It's a modification of the Brothers Grimm version of the story. Little girl goes to visit grandma. She gets stuck in forest traffic. By the time she gets to grandma's house, grandma's eaten by the wolf. So it's not the same wolf as the one in the Three Little Pigs story, actually. The antagonist in this story may well have been a werewolf. There's actually a movie that came out not too many years ago where that's part of the story. And the werewolf has this ability to appear human to the grandma, right? So it's a wolf 2.0, new and improved. So Little Red arrives, right? She's kind of looking at the situation suspiciously. She starts to ask the questions, all the right questions to try to diagnose the situation. She hears all the right answers, but lets down her guard, right? So she hears all the answers that put her at ease, right? Like everything's fine, right? These big ears are to hear you better with, right? And so she lets down her guard and she doesn't take any action, right? She doesn't take any appropriate action. So she gets eaten up and things are pretty bad until the hunter shows up and kind of saves the day, right? So the part where Little Red gathers a lot of data and fails to draw any appropriate actionable conclusions from it is very important here, right? So hospitals, for example, push doctors to adopt telemedicine in this period of time. Many of them made a really good effort, but part of the difficulty is that the information that you're generating during a typical televisit is not always actionable. So they say data is a new oil, right? But in order to generate higher value products from oil, products and services, you need to refine it and process it appropriately. So we say that human knowledge comes in 5 stages. You go from data to information to knowledge to understanding and then to wisdom, right? So with healthcare related data, we're struggling how to generate actionable information, right? In order to move forward toward understanding and wisdom. And so some of the most promising new tech developments probably have to do with the breakthroughs in understanding the molecular and genetic basis for disease, right? And the various screening assays and genetic sequencing and chemical synthesis technologies that enable us to digitally create cures, like the new wave of cancer drugs, mRNA vaccine, and so on. That stuff is getting really, really good now. But we also need to keep in mind that these solutions require in-patient level of interaction to get the necessary actionable data. And that's not always possible. It's becoming less and less possible, more and more difficult, more expensive, right? So if we look at the current situation, right, and we look at a scene like this, right, that wasn't common, we can ask some questions, right? If you're a person from another planet showing up and you're looking at all of this stuff, right, you're asking what the heck is going on here? So, here they're waiting for a COVID test maybe, right? And the reason we need this widespread testing is that actually the majority of people catching COVID, they're not going to die, right? But they're going to be able to spread the disease asymptomatically to many people who would die. So Wolf 2.0, a werewolf that appears to be a perfectly safe human, right? Until the moon comes up 3 days after the infection. So we have a big polarization now in our country and many other countries where people have a choice between essentially treating every grandma like she's a wolf or treating every werewolf as if it was a regular person, right? So, 90% or more maybe of people aren't infectious or not in danger of themselves dying from COVID, right? So why does everybody have to endure wearing these masks and all the other, lockdowns and so on? And we're asking the right questions, but we aren't really getting enough of the right kind of data soon enough for us to do anything about it, soon enough for us to act, right? So, or you look at a scene like this, for example, very familiar scene, no masks. What are these people waiting for? I think they're just waiting for a new phone. I'm very excited to get one. Anyway, so before the COVID pandemic, we actually had other epidemics, right? In the U.S., at least, there was and still is an opioid epidemic. In 2019, estimates have about 50,000 people dying from opioid overuse. And over the last 20 years, about 500,000 Americans died from opioid overuse, which is actually comparable numbers to how many died from COVID-19. In most cases, here from opioid overuse, they were in relatively younger and otherwise healthier adults, right? With many, many years of life ahead of them. And so 20 years is a longer duration than the present COVID crisis, right? But it's been actually a rapidly rising trend in the last 5 years. And we've known about it for a long time. And yet we didn't do a whole lot, right? So where does the system model come in, and how can we use the model to gain insights? So just as a reminder, the 5-component system model consists of 5 main components: the package payload, the source element that emits the package payload, the distribution element that transmits it, the tool element that receives and uses the package payload, and the control element that orchestrates the flow of transactions involving this package payload. For scalable system, all 5 components have to be present and they have to be interacting properly. So the value in this is that we can project this concept onto some reality, right? And we do mapping. So you look at this given situation through the lens of this model, we identify the components that are present there in their various embodiments, right? And we try to spot components that are missing or underdeveloped, or a relationship between the components that isn't working properly. And so, it turns out that the control element in particular is very critical for the scalability of a system. So, and the control element itself has to have sufficient knowledge about the state of all of the elements of the system, all of the other elements of the system, in order to execute its function, right? So our detailed model accounts for these considerations in a very methodical way, one of which is to ensure that each element of the system, and most crucially, I would say the package payload, possesses what we call an aboutness. That is information about the package payload, its origins, its destination, its contents, and so on. So the control element knows how to route it, knows what to do. The mapping of this 5-component system model onto the healthcare system reductively views the system's intent as producing health, right? Where patients entering the system are mapped as the packaged payload. And so in order to route the patient to the proper destination, right, take out the sickness, put in some health, the system needs aboutness of the packaged payload, right? We need to know stuff about the patient. And we can debate the drivers behind the opioid epidemic. For example, one enabling aspect has been availability of drugs, coupled with a lack of knowledge and control over what happens to the medications after they get prescribed. And so as a consequence, it's a lot easier for people to become addicted, and the system has no aboutness, right, on the patient and the drugs being overused until it's much too late. So Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome, right? So from the standpoint of systems thinking, both the COVID epidemic and the opioid epidemic, the wolves are able to wreak havoc because the system lacks critical aboutness. It lacks the relevant data, information, knowledge about the state of things. in particular on the patient population. And so it's unable to take action. It's unable to develop understanding and wisdom to deal with it. And any bottlenecks we're experiencing right now with regard to getting trustworthy, actionable aboutness will continue to allow the wolf to eat Little Red. So when we look at certain situations, like typical waiting in line for something, we already have at the same time happening a completely different mode of doing things, right? So people who began to order their food using Amazon Prime services in the US, at least, they look at the people that go to the supermarket, or maybe even themselves that used to do this a couple of years ago, or standing around waiting in long lines in crowded situations. They look at that as dumb, right? That past is dumb. And so they vow to never do that again. So the current business and technology solution in healthcare basically requires each patient to present to the hospital. So they have to become an inpatient for at least a portion of time in order for the healthcare system to gain even a bit of aboutness regarding the patient. And in the process of doing so, the patient's exposed to a host of pathogens and which may actually make the situation worse for them. In a lot of cases, they have to travel really long distances, right? And in the US, 30,000 automobile accident deaths each year, right? Like, so that alone, just getting to the hospital could be pretty treacherous, right? So, all right, so what's that crazy future look like, right? According to Henry Ford, competitive advantage in a manufacturing intensive business depends on being able to make and sell the product using economies of scale, right? So scalability has to be part of your advantage there. According to Sam Walton, father of Walmart, and Jeff Bezos, father of Amazon, a competitive advantage in a retail business is driven by knowledge about your customer, which depends on being able to collect the data and derive understanding from it, right? So the business of manufacturing health depends on both the information and manufacturability of the various widgets that are going to provide a new wellspring of information, a fount of information about the patient. And so one insight we think that the system model suggests to us is regarding the key technical challenge in healthcare, which is encapsulated maybe like this. So how can we cost effectively deliver inpatient quality aboutness in an outpatient context? Okay, so just a couple of examples, maybe just one example, right? You can think of lots of examples from published scientific work, technology development, patents, your own research and development activities that fit into the system model of providing inpatient grade of information in an outpatient context, right? So one example is looking at joint movement. And this is work that was done in our group recently, looking at joint injuries, which are incredibly costly. So cost of treatment of these things and lost wages is estimated as over $100 billion a year. And measurement of joint function involves manually yanking on the arm, let's say, on the arm of a person, and measuring range of motion using a goniometer. And so the error in that measurement could be as much as 45%. So how do you gauge progress? How do you know the person's doing what they need to do and recovering as fast as they can? Right? This is what it looks like. And there's papers on how to do it properly and training and all kinds of things like that. I myself busted my collarbone in a bike race, and I had to go through treatment. Quite painful, and I was supposed to do exercises, and I went home and I didn't do those exercises, and I think that's probably common to common story that you might hear from everybody that's undergone physical therapy. But here's an example of a wearable sensor that in combination with other technologies could actually quantify your range of motion and how much exercise you do in an outpatient context. So this work from our group by Aaron Efke and Dilara Melli, where they created these Kirigami-based sensors that are mounted on the shoulder. A person could go about their daily life and generate a wellspring of information in terms of how they use their joint, what the range of motion is, and so on, right? So at this point, we say, okay, the technological question was, how can we cost effectively deliver inpatient quality aboutness in an outpatient context? And the related business question has to do with this cost effectiveness, for example. You know, what is the business model that's going to support the technological solutions of the future? And in many ways, we already have examples of such business models. So another example of an epidemic has been the epidemic of obesity and cardiovascular disease. Over 10% or 12%, I think, actually, of Americans, which is about 30 million people, have high cholesterol levels and are in danger of dying from cardiovascular disease. So the development of statins, for example, as drugs, is estimated to save tens of thousands of lives every year by lowering their cholesterol levels. And it works provided the patients are diagnosed with high levels of LDL cholesterol and are prescribed statins, and then provided that they take them properly and regularly. So the business model that supports this kind of treatment, this kind of solution to the problem, is a subscription model, right? And a lot of the diagnosis and monitoring and then treatment is done in an outpatient type setting. So same with blood sugar imbalances, right? Type 1 and type 2 diabetes, increasingly many other diseases as well. So these aren't in themselves examples of an idealized healthcare system, right? But they're interesting examples. They're current and they include technological solutions as well as business models that are coupled with those treatment modalities or those technological solutions that are currently saving lives. So, in conclusion here, and then I'll be happy to take questions, is that the technological and business models that will support healthcare of the future have to necessarily enable inpatient quality aboutness generation in an outpatient setting. And they're probably going to include robust diagnostics technologies coupled with pharmaceutical technologies, and most likely a subscription-based business model to support them.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, thank you, Max. Very interesting talk. Nice to see the anecdotes as well involving the fairy tales. So thank you for that. Yeah, you'll have us all thinking about these fairy tales now for the rest of the day. Yeah. Maybe if I could just start off by asking one or two questions. Just, I guess maybe this concept of aboutness, really is pointing towards connected health. Is it really, and really trying to get the key actionable data from these connected health systems? What aspect of the system model is most important, in addressing that challenge, do you think? Is it the control system? Is it the tool? Is it the source of information? Where do you think the challenges lie?
Well, there's this concept of Theranostics, right? Theranos is an unfortunate example of a company that had kind of the right idea of what needed to be done, but basically lied to people, right? And didn't get there. Yeah. But the idea was a good idea, that you need some way of very quickly and very easily of generating a lot of information about the person. And what they needed, right, was a blood sample. What they needed was a blood sample. And there's a whole area of sensors and diagnostics technology that sort of goes under the banner of blood, sweat, and tears, okay. Right? So how do we get the bioanalytes that are going to tell us about the person? And so in a way, you can imagine two systems sitting on top of each other. They're two coupled systems. It's kind of like, Google's involvement in self-driving vehicles. If a person spends 2 hours a day commuting, let's say, and they'd rather be, working or browsing the internet, right? You could imagine that having a self-driving car would enable that. And so while the person is sitting there in their self-driving vehicle, or maybe it's in a metro car on their cell phone, they're generating a whole fountain of information. And Google and all kinds of IT companies are going to be harvesting that information, right, and monetizing that information. And so you could imagine one system, which is a transportation system, which takes person, which is the package payload, from point A to point B, from the source to the tool, right, through the highway system, let's say, or the train tracks and so on. And this person is now generating Aboutness, which is, they become, the package payload you see in generating this Aboutness becomes a source of information. So there's another system sitting on top of that, which is the information system, that's got its own 5 components, right? And the source of information in that system is the package payload that's in the first system. Yeah. So in the healthcare system, right, you also have a kind of situation where the patient, when they're interacting with the healthcare system in a physical way, they present to the hospital and so on, they're the package payload, right? But once you start generating information about the bioanalytes that are floating around inside of them, right, that person becomes the source of package payloads that are informational package payloads. So your devices, let's say, that you develop to enable that kind of useful, actionable information, contextual information, right? They become the sources. They become the sources.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a multi-layered approach, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So, the concept of a system applies, but it's recursive too, and it's layered. So you can have multiple systems that are interacting with each other that are linked by certain common elements, but the package payload in one could become the source in another.
Yeah, okay. And then, do you have any kind of wisdom, oftentimes when we're developing system models for various products or concepts, or if we were all to do it independently, we'd all come up with a slightly different model. Is there any guidance really on what is the starting point for identifying the core aspects of your system? Do you start with the source, or do you start with the tool side?
You could start either way. I think a lot of it's just going to depend on where people's knowledge basis is, right, and where their expertise is. And so it's going to be natural for some folks to start at the source side, some people start at the tool side, and so on. It just depends a little bit on what your business is. But at the end of the day, of course, everybody has to come together and have that conversation and then put their thoughts on the board so that everybody can look at the same thing and say, oh, I see where we fit in. There's a question here in the chat, for example, about the biggest barrier to developing the practice of Aboutness in future healthcare, right? And I think that that's a related question, because some people, right, that are associated with the system are going to want as much information as possible. But other people that are going to be part of this system might want as little information as possible, just enough to act on, right? If I'm a patient, I don't necessarily want to give people a ton of information about me, right? Just enough, just enough, right? And so I think it's an interesting ethical, for example, question and a trade-off that we have to resolve, that on the one hand, we need as much information as possible in order to give people what they need and what they want, but at the same time, navigate this idea that the people themselves don't want to give us a lot of the times, right, any of this information, which would help them, right? Yeah. So that's a trade-off that we have to resolve, and how we do that. There's technologies for being able to do that that are out there that people are practicing that are going to be important. Blockchain and so on and so forth, right? But
yeah, that's interesting. I guess you have your system model, and it's kind of an engineering approach, but then you have to, it's subject to the human interpretation of the human willingness to participate in the various aspects.
Yeah. Ian, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I hope. Yeah, that was the question in the chat.
Yeah.
Jared, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah. Maybe so I suppose maybe you're kind of indicating that the flow of people through hospitals then is subject to so many risks and challenges. Like, is the hospital's days numbered? Is that what you're suggesting really in the future?
That's a good question. For one, so pharmacies are an interesting example where people go to the pharmacy to get their medications and to get certain advice and so on and so forth. But chances are the pharmacy as we know it, as we see it today, is dead.
Okay.
It's a zombie, right? Amazon is very rapidly trying to get into that system, as the distributor for medications. There's also a very interesting value chain associated with getting pharmaceuticals to people, so getting medicines to people. And if you look at that value chain, there are some really key players there that control everything that you've never heard of. And they're making money like crazy. And so, there are some companies that are trying to get around that. Companies that are in the business are very well aware of it. You want to get rid of those folks, but there's nothing that they can really do about them at the moment. So is the hospital dead? I think for some things the hospital is still going to be really, really important, and you can't avoid it. There's a ton of diagnostic stuff that probably will have to be done in this kind of way that it's currently done for years and years, big MRI machines and so on. But at the same time, folks in the tech world are developing solutions and technologies to be able to perform those functions in much more compact ways. And so eventually, I think we're going to get to a point where, there will be ways of collecting X-rays without the person having to go to the hospital. Already that's happening to some extent.
Yeah, and I suppose I think you really succinctly put it where that people might enter the hospital once we know what the ailment is, rather than entering it without knowing.
That's right.
Aspect. You mentioned your startup company. I was intrigued to kind of ask just, what's that about? In complementary medicine.
Well, we're on the next one now. Our startup initially in the wellness space was when I realized, after living in Michigan for a long time, after moving here from California, California to New Jersey, then to Michigan, is that lighting plays a really important role in health and wellness, right? Our circadian rhythms and hormone levels and so on are very strongly linked to amount of daylight and the quality of daylight that we get. And interestingly, you could look at instances of depression on a population level. Depression has this kind of cyclic behavior that ends up peaking, after the dark months, and it has to do with lowering of certain hormone levels in the body. And you could even very strong correlations to suicide rates and so on. And so it's a known thing. How do people deal with it? And it turns out in the U.S., for example, 60 to 70% of real estate has no access to natural light, even during the summer. In Europe, there's building codes that are purposely set up to make sure that people get adequate amount of daylight in buildings during the workday. And so our company at that time was a lighting company, basically, that created artificial skylights that fooled people into thinking that they could be in the basement of a skyscraper, right? But with 50 floors above them. But it would look like they were on the top floor with a ceiling that has a skylight in it. And the skylight would change color, intensity, and kind of direction of light during the day, and really made people feel good. And we had a whole bunch of units that are sold. And anyway, eventually the company folded for various reasons that I'm not going to discuss here. But now we have another company that we're trying to get off the ground that has to do with a new way of manufacturing pharmaceuticals and developing even developing drugs in a much more efficient way. So it's kind of like a pharmaceutical technology. So I'm very interested in this space. We may even try to get the shoulder sensor, off the ground in some commercial way. But I'm very interested in this space. I think it's a really high value problem, and the time is right for finding a lot of the solutions.
Yeah, and of course, we discussed the opioid and the COVID pandemic, or epidemic and pandemic. Do you think that presents an opportunity for disruption now, maybe, do you think?
Yeah. All of a sudden, people saw that they live in straw houses, right? Essentially. Right. It really sometimes, if you think about the Three Little Pigs story, right? After that, the wolf incident, after the threat comes about, it's absolutely clear that the only viable building technology is this brick house, right, in the big universe. And so everything, all business models and all tech, they collapse into that one thing that supports that particular tech scenario in that business model, right? Yeah. So, some folks start specializing in making bricks, and some folks start specializing in making, cement and distribution systems, and there's a whole construction methodology that goes along with it. It's very different from what people used to do with straw and sticks, right? And so it's the same kind of situation, right? All of a sudden, telemedicine, oh my God, this is what we're going to do. Look, I'm giving a talk in Ireland,
Yeah.
It's a totally different thing, but it's kludgy, right? And so people are very rapidly now starting to develop solutions for these things. Zoom, right? Zoom was nobody. You were absolutely nobody before the pandemic. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's the mainstay, right? Where are all of the, GoToMeeting and all these other things, like, So yeah, I believe so. You're absolutely right. It's a huge opportunity for people, because all of a sudden the weaknesses, the fragility of the current system was revealed.
Yeah. And like, I guess, with Zoom, for virtual consultations, and then with the additional package payloads of other sensors and measurements that could be done on connected health, it's probably a big opportunity for new systems. Yeah.
There's a question, another question in the chat.
You're great at spotting the questions, thanks.
Yeah. I opened the chat and I see them coming through. Do you have any advice on how we can use the system model to guide policy in our regions with respect to technology and the adoption of the key enabling technologies? Well, you have to look, right? It could very well be region specific. There are some things that you probably do very well in the region and some things that you could do better. I think where I would start is I would kind of do a survey of what's there already, basically do this kind of projection and say, all right, so healthcare system, here it is, here's the model system. Let's project it onto what we actually have in place. And at what scale is everything operating, and how well is it operating? And then you identify whether the elements are present, what are the embodiments, right? And how well are they working?
Okay.
Right. So if we're going to use the system model, again, it's not the be all end all, right? But if we're going to use it as a tool, let's project it onto what's currently there in the region. Let's see what's actually working, right?
Okay.
Who's doing what, and who's doing things well, and what are the things that are missing? Now, you don't necessarily have to sort of focus on applying it only in your region, right? It would certainly be nice to eat your own dog food, right? If we can, but also there's a lot of export, right? Like how many mechanical watches does Switzerland really need, right? Like they export a lot of that stuff, right? How many medicines do they need? They export a lot of that stuff. Chocolate, I mean, they can only eat so much. There's a lot of export going on. But it's interesting that they're really high value add products, right? They're really high margin products that Switzerland generates. Now, a lot of those things are not going to be for export because they're too expensive. Wine, for example, Swiss wine, it's pretty good, but it's too damn expensive. And it's not going to be competitive with French wine or Chilean wine or Australian, New Zealand wine. But chocolate and pharmaceuticals, wow, people are willing to pay for that. And so there may be something similar kind of in your region that you could look at and say, oh yeah, this is something that could be high margin that we could export, but also apply it to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Eat your own dog food.
Okay, an interesting question, right? Taking the system model and applying it to a regional dynamic, for the medical device sector in Galway, for instance, or someplace in Ireland or elsewhere. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, coming up to the end, I suppose, Max. So I just wanted to kind of just say thanks again for your support of our project. So this presentation will go up live, it'll be there, and we'll keep you informed on the number of views. We'll also put a link to your book there.
Cool.
So just to keep people informed if they were so inclined to follow it up. We bought several copies of your book, just to say, so I give them to students regularly. So well done on developing the model and providing such an entertaining presentation to us.
Well, thank you. We're starting to work on a follow-up, another book.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So we look forward to that. Very detailed book, I hope.
Yeah, it'll be great fun.
Okay. So listen, I'd like to thank the attendees who joined today. So thank you, and thanks to the Atlantic KetMed community and to BioNow, who supported the presentation today from the UK. So we leave it at that, Max, and we'll be in touch shortly. I have lots of other issues to chat with you, and thank you again. Okay, and thanks, Jeff and Helen, for supporting. Okay, take care and enjoy your day. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.